our Bridge Builder sponsors, Beth and Mike Colson and Colson Oil. We are profoundly grateful for your ongoing friendship and support of this series for the second year in a row. Thank you so much. You know, I'm particularly excited about our program this evening, and I can assure you that it will be entertaining and it will be a very poignant conversation. I'm delighted to welcome my dear friend Jean Becker, who served as the Deputy Press Secretary for First Lady Barbara Bush in the White House, and subsequently as Chief of Staff for President George H.W. Bush and Mrs. Bush throughout their post-presidency years. This program was originally scheduled back in March, right after the publication of Pearls of Wisdom, Little Pieces of Advice that Go a Long Way. You'll see it right here. And if you haven't purchased it yet, I'm sure you will want to after tonight's program. The book features many of Mrs. Bush's pearls of wisdom that Jean gathered from Mrs. Bush's family and her many friends. We're thrilled tonight that Jean is joined virtually by a few very special guests. Doro Bush Cook, author, philanthropist, and daughter of First Lady Barbara Bush, as well as her two sons, Sam LeBlond and Robert Cook. We're so glad that you all could participate in the conversation tonight. And I want to thank everyone who is joining us virtually. Many of you submitted questions for the program, and there were so many of them that Jean and I grouped them together, and we will hope to answer as many of those as we can later in the conversation. But it's now my honor to introduce a big fan of Jean's, President Clinton. President Clinton has often said that his friendship with the Bush family has been one of his life's greatest gift. We are so pleased that you could join us tonight, President Clinton. So I'll turn it over to you now to say a few words to get us started.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. I want to thank Mike and Beth Colson, Colson Oil, for helping us again to promote Bridge Builders virtually. And thank Jean and Doro and Sam and Robert for being part of the program tonight. I think I'm probably Jean's biggest Democratic fan. Wonderful job for President and Mrs. Bush, and her book is just great, and it's worth remembering Barbara Bush's wisdom tonight, as well as her toughness and her sense of humor. They're all pretty powerful and a very powerful combination. I don't want to take any time away from the presenters, but just to say that I'm especially grateful that Jean asked me to participate in the book, and the incident she describes in the book actually happened. When in 2005, Barbara Bush referred to George Bush and me as the odd couple, and she said, and she looked at me and she said, or as I call him, son. And then I had to admit that every big family had at least one black sheep, and I qualified. But it was on that day, more than 20 years after I first met her, that I felt like finally I won her over. She had this wonderful look that said to everybody, I've got your number, but I like you anyway. Everything you did for her and for President Bush and for providing this wonderful book. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, President Clinton.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. So Stephanie, I think you told me that is he still listening?
Yes, he is.
Before we talk about Pearls of Wisdom, I'm going to tell one of my favorite stories about President Bush and President Clinton. I still get asked today if their friendship was real, or was it just, something they did for show and was it a good act? And here's the story I always tell. Pope John Paul II has died, and the President of the United States, George W. Bush, has asked all the former presidents to accompany him and First Lady Laura Bush to Rome. And then President Clinton's chief of staff, a woman named Laura Graham, called me to say that President Clinton had just had heart surgery and his doctor said he absolutely could not go. But that he told Laura, I think I'm going to call my friend George Bush and ask his opinion on whether I should go. And Laura said, you must tell President Bush to tell my boss he cannot go. He cannot fly to Rome. So I run into President Bush's office and I tell him the conversation. He says, I got this, Jean. I'll handle it. So sure enough, President Clinton calls, asks, he says, George, he says, my doctor doesn't think I should go, but I was wondering what you thought. To which George Herbert Walker Bush said, well, Bill, I think you can go to the funeral. I don't see any problem with you going to the Pope's funeral. You know, they have that great, medical unit on Air Force One, and there'll be lots of doctors to look after you. And I'm waving at President Bush saying, no, no, no. You're supposed to tell him not to go. And President Bush covers up the phone and he says, but I want him to go. It'd be fun to hang out with Bill. I want Bill to go. And I'm embarrassed to say, I think I said, what are you, junior high girls? No. And so to make a long story short, President Clinton went. And from what I understand, they did have a fine time, but and he got back safe and sound. But I always tell that story as proof that yes, indeed, they were truly the odd couple. They truly did become best friends, including enjoying going to funerals together. That's my story. Now, do you want me to start talking about pearls of wisdom? So first of all, I just want all of you to know who were planning to come be with us in Little Rock on March 17th. You're so lucky, because that was just going to be me. And because that got canceled because of the pandemic, tonight you get 3 Bush family members, the Bush's daughter Doro and her 2 sons, Sam and Robert. So it's going to be a lot of fun. But before we start talking, I want 2 things. One, first of all, to tell you that on these evening webinars, just to mix it up a little bit, and because everybody's at home, no one has to drive anywhere, we're going to play a little drinking game, or as I've started calling it, a sipping game. I've decided to call it a sipping game to be politically correct. Every time you hear the word Ganny, which is what the Bush grandkids called their grandmother, or Gampy, which is what they called President Bush, I want you to take a sip. I said a sip, not a swig, of whatever you're drinking. So, so it works like this. When I introduce Robert and Sam to talk about their Ganny, oh, Ganny, you'll take a little sip. Okay, while we practice that, before we start talking about Mrs. Bush, I have a video to show you all. It is Mrs. Bush's voice that you're going to hear in this book. It's her words of wisdom. So we like to start all these webinars by showing a video so you really can hear her voice giving you some great advice. So if we could show that video now, that would be terrific.
One night, I absolutely couldn't sleep and found myself thinking about what I've learned in life, sometimes the hard way. Try to find the good in people and not the bad. Isn't it better to make a friend than an enemy? Do not buy what you cannot afford. Don't try to live up to your neighbors, and be sure you pay people back. Value your friends, and remember that loyalty is a two-way street. Love your children. Don't worry that your children never listen to you. Worry that they're always watching you.
Those human connections with spouses, with children, with friends are the most important investment you will ever make.
That you really shouldn't take yourself or life too seriously. Someone once said there are 2 kinds of people in the world. There are those that wake up in the morning and say, "Good morning, Lord." And there are others who wake up and say, "Good Lord, it's morning." Make sure you're the former and not the latter. None of us are the same. None of us are perfect, but it's our cracks and flaws that make our lives together so very interesting.
Fathers and mothers, if you have children, they must come first. You must read to your children, and you must hug your children, and you must love your children. Your success as a family, our success as a society, depends not on what happens in the White House, but on what happens inside your house. Somewhere out in this audience may even be someone who will one day follow in my footsteps and preside over the White House as the president's spouse, and I wish him well.
I still believe that if more people could read, write, and comprehend, we could solve so many of our problems. The parents we've met are determined to teach their children integrity, strength, responsibility, courage, sharing, love of God, and pride in being an American. Remember, at the end of your life, you will never regret not having passed one more test, not winning one more verdict, or closing one more deal. You will regret time not spent with a spouse, a child, a parent, or a friend. No matter what our problems, we can always find people who are worse off than we are. Help them and forget self. And above all, seek God. There is absolutely no downside.
Okay, before I kick it over to Doro, let me just read something really brief from the book, in which Mrs. Bush talks about that she knew she was bossy. She admitted that she was bossy. And here's what she said at one point. She says, I can't give you advice on how to be a good teacher or a writer or a scientist or an actor or a dancer. I especially can't give you advice on dancing. But at this point in my life, I can share with you some ideas on how to survive the inevitable ups and downs. After all, in 80 years of living, she actually lived until she was 93. I have survived 6 children, 17 grandchildren, 6 wars, a book by Kitty Kelly, 2 presidents, 2 governors, big election day wins, and big election day losses. I'm looking at you, President Clinton, on the last one. And 61 years of marriage to a husband who keeps jumping out of perfectly good airplanes. So it's just possible that along the way, I've learned a thing or two. So as I mentioned, we're very lucky to have one of those 6 children with us and 2 of the grandkids. So Doro, I would love to turn it over to you for you to talk about your mom, and first of all, just update us on your life and then talk about what you learned from your mom.
Sure. It's an honor for me to be here. It was wonderful to see President Clinton, and I would just build, Jean, on what you said about their relationship and their friendship. And what I loved most about their relationship was that no one believed it was genuine. No one thought it was real, like you said. And I was in Maine for many of the visits when President Clinton kindly came up to see Dad. And I remember long lunches out on the back deck, and then out to dinner in Kennebunkport even. And then when Dad got older, President Clinton coming to sit with him in his bedroom. And I remember they talked about the politics of the day and a little gossip thrown in, which Dad always loved. And Dad was very proud of the work he did with President Clinton. And I know President Clinton knows this, but he genuinely loved President Clinton. And so I want to thank President Clinton for coming on today and being with us. But we're talking about Mom. And so I'm up here in Maine. You wanted an update. I'm up here in Maine, waiting for my brother, President Bush 43, to come. My brother Neil's coming tomorrow. And all of my son Sam is coming on Friday, and you'll see him in a minute. And Robert will come in July. And so everybody's gathering. We're not having any guests this summer because of what's going on in the world. But we just feel very lucky. But Mom, what did you ask me about Mom?
Well, you just talk about what you learned from her. When you think about your mom and what she taught you about life.
Yeah. So what I learned from Mom was to be yourself. She was very much herself. She had no pretenses. She didn't care about clothes. She didn't dye her hair. One time she got a bundle of Ked sneakers for her birthday, and she would wear them mismatched. She would wear one red sneaker and one blue sneaker, and she didn't care because she thought it was fun. And so be yourself and look for the good and leave the rest behind. And hold your family close. I think those are the 3 things that I learned from Mom.
I love how Doro was graciously wrote the epilogue for the book. And one of the last things you say in the book is that your mom always said you had 2 choices in life.
Yep.
And what were talk about those 2 choices. And boy, do I think about that a lot.
The 2 choices are you can be happy or you can be grumpy, but choose happy. And she did that. And she went through a lot of ups and downs in her life. And she always chose to be happy. And so that's what I try to do. She was a great teacher. She had a lot of advice, and I mean a lot of advice. So those are just 3 things that I picked up from her, but she was full of it. And it's all in your book, Jean.
Well, it was a lot of fun to write, and the family, you all were so generous in everything that you shared about your mom and your Ganny, the word Ganny. So anyone who has a drink, I invite you to take a little sip. Sam, we're coming to you as the.
Great, Jean.
So Sam has not had a haircut yet in the pandemic, and I just want to. Neither have I. But I like what's happening with Sam's look here. I do wonder what your Ganny would think. But first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're up to, and then talk to us about your Ganny.
Sure. Well, Jean, thank you for including me. As you can see in the background, this will give you an idea of kind of one of the things I'm up to these days, and it's a shameless plug. Hopefully that's okay with you here. But I'm currently hosting a podcast about the amazing life of service that my grandparents, including my grandmother, have left behind. So, especially during this time with COVID-19, we're spending a lot of time interviewing family and friends and a lot of people who knew them best, and even people who didn't know them who do amazing things in the community. That's one thing that I'm really focusing on here in Washington, D.C. D.C., unfortunately, is currently one of the hotbeds, so we're pretty much locked down, but it's given us a great opportunity to explore, and for me personally and kind of selfishly, to explore their lives in different ways by talking to amazing people. Like today I had a great conversation with Pam Shriver, the great tennis player, or I know someone asked a question about the Wellesley speech. I just had a great conversation with Ed McNally, who is one of the speechwriters who helped with that, groundbreaking speech. So, Vice President Dan Quayle, et cetera. My mother was the first on the podcast. So that's really been consuming a lot of my time recently. Beyond that, my wife Lee and I and our dog Howdy have been hiking and socially distancing and trying to do our best to distance, but we're looking forward, as my mom hinted to, we're looking forward to a change of scenery. We'll be going to Maine this upcoming Friday for 10 days to spend some time with family and looking to, get out of town for a little bit, which we're really looking forward to. But really excited about the conversation today, Jean, and thank you for including me in this.
Well, talk to us, talk a little bit about your Ganny and some of the things you learned from her.
Sure. Well, I've learned a lot, and Mom said she had advice for everybody. Most of the time unsolicited, especially when it came to people like me who were maybe a little bit of troublemakers when I was younger. I don't want to completely, I guess the statute of limitations is up on most of the things that we used to do, but a lot of the advice, especially the recent advice, is things that I really took to heart. Towards the end of our life, I've been married to my wife for 3 years, and we asked for advice on marriage. And I actually, this is actually my pearl of wisdom. Hopefully I'm not jumping ahead, Jean, but I have the letter that she sent me right here.
Oh, there's the letter. No, I'd love you to read
of course,
it. That's perfect.
And I wanted to share kind of a little bit of the letter because I think it was we were soliciting marriage advice. And for my grandparents, for those who know, they were married for over 70 years, which is an amazing feat. And so I'll read the quick excerpt, and then we'll pass it on to my brother Robert, who also has gotten a lot of great advice throughout the years. But this is what she wrote, and it's very quick. I'll be quick. She said, "Happy anniversary. I was asked for a little advice on a happy life." She said, "You really don't need it, for you were brought up in a happy home, thanks to my mother, but most of all because you love and respect each other. But here's my advice. Each one of you should go 75% of the way, and to remember to laugh. Love, your Ganny." Oh, me too. But, you know, and that was great advice, and that's something that Lee and I really try to do, and it's great advice, going 75% of the way, and to laugh, because especially now when, you know, we have so much uncertainty going on, laughter and comedy, it's something that was so important in Gampy and Ganny's life. If you knew them like we did, I mean, my grandfather, they're two of the funniest people I've ever known. And they use the laughter and going that extra 25% of the way with each other to really have a great relationship that, you know, lasts for so long. So I think when Lee and I were engaged, we joked that if we could be married for 70 years like my grandparents, I would be 101 and she would be 98. So there's a small chance that we could make it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you know, these days it's really a true test to their marriage and how much they really loved each other, that they were married for that long and were such great partners with each other.
I say go for it. Now, Sam, while we talk to Robert, I am going to ask both you and Robert in a little bit to tell the story of the angriest you remember your Ganny ever becoming at you. So think about it. You got in the most trouble with her. I'm going to read something from the book, some advice she gave the grandparents and parents of other teenagers. But let's first go to Robert in Nashville, from Nashville, Tennessee. Hey, Robert, tell us what you're up to these days.
I think between Sam and I, there'll be a few to choose from in terms of angriest moments with Ganny. But I'm putting on my glasses to look at your mom. Yeah, she's laughing. Down here in Nashville, I just moved into a new house with my girlfriend Kitty, which is very exciting. Someone who my grandmother loved very much, and I'm so glad that they got to meet before she passed. But all's well here, working. We're both working full time, and you know, so obviously being as safe as possible with everything that's going on. But that's the latest. I'm excited to get up to join my mother up in Maine. That's kind of what I'm looking forward to the most for the summer. And yeah, that's kind of the latest, Jean.
Just tell us, so before I read this passage about how your grandmother handled teenage grandchildren in the house, just overall, what did you learn from your grandmother?
Yeah, so I think something that's even become more important with everything that's going on in the world is Ganny always preached the importance of keeping your mind active as well as your body active. So, you know, by keeping your mind active, Ganny was always reading. She was always needle pointing, talking to friends and family, having coffee early in the morning with, you know, all her sons and mom. And, you know, her mind was always active and you know, up until the very end. And from the physical standpoint, she was always swimming laps in the pool, biking around Walker's Point, walking the dogs, always doing something. And, you know, I think with everyone kind of being stuck inside right now, both of those things are so important to occupy your mind in certain ways. So that is a big lesson I learned from Ganny. I love the video you had to start, those clips of her with all her pearls of wisdom. And, you know, I love when she says, don't take yourself too seriously.
I know. It's just great to hear her voice.
Yeah.
Well, I cannot tell a lie. Sometimes in the summertime, time when she and your Gampy loved when Walker's Point was crawling with family and grandkids. But in the fall of, I can't remember what year, but one fall, right after all of you had been at Walker's Point, a big chunk of the summer, she gave this speech. And this was the advice she gave the people in the audience when their teenage grandchildren came to visit. She says, maybe I can help prevent you from making some of the mistakes I think we made with our grandchildren. Be careful of criticizing their clothes. What they change into could be tighter and shorter than what you made them take off. I'm thinking this didn't happen to Sam and Robert, but you know, who knows? If you have a lot of tension and you get a headache, do what it says on the aspirin bottle. Take 2 aspirin and keep away from children. You can't hide a piece of broccoli and a glass of milk. That would be funny if I was talking about a grandchild. President Bush infamously hated broccoli. Don't lend your car to anyone you gave birth to or their offspring. And last but not least, if you remain calm, you just don't have all the facts. So yeah, so Sam and Robert, I don't know who wants to go first. Sam, maybe we'll go back to you. What do you remember the biggest thing you got into trouble about with your Ganny?
Oh my gosh. Sadly, there's so many, Jean, and it's I hate to admit, these are younger years. I've grown up a lot since then, and Ganny and I became very close and later in life, but I'm trying to think. My partner in crime, and I guess I can call him out because he's not here growing up, was Jeb Bush Jr. We were both the same age, so him and I had a couple, probably too many confrontations with Ganny over the years. I'd say one that sticks out, and I hope I don't get in trouble for talking about this, but I think it's okay, and it's too late now, right, Jean? But
yes,
when Jebby and I were younger, we used to use my grandmother's computer. Okay.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to tell this story. Yes.
Okay. So we'd go up and use her computer, and I'd say we were probably 13, 14 years old, young, maybe even younger. So a long time ago. And we would find ourselves, as the World Wide Web, sometimes happens. You kind of make your way to maybe some more unsavory material that 2 young boys might be searching out. And this is funny because my grandfather was always kind of a jokester or a prankster. And somehow, I guess through the internet service, they found out that, maybe a couple internet sites that didn't look like they should be used by my grandmother were being used. And so he drafted a letter. And the letter was to my grandmother. And it was from, and Jean, you might be able to help me who it was from. It was from the commission.
It was from the federal court system in Portland, Maine, a federal judge in Portland.
And it said something along the lines of, Mrs. Bush, we've been monitoring your computer, and we've seen that, you've been looking at some unsavory websites, and we have to call you in, or maybe Jean, you can pick up the rest of the story from here. But I remember it being terrifying for us because we thought we had been caught not only by my grandparents, but by the authority.
So I'm going to amend the story a little bit. Sam, you're such a responsible adult, but what happened is you and Jeb Jr. managed to print out pornography and leave it on your grandmother's printer. You're much wiser now that you're growing up, but you got on a porn site. I like the word unsavory websites. It was porn.
I was trying to hold it back a little bit.
I think the Clinton Library draws an adult conversation, an adult audience. I think we can handle it. But anyway, you left some of the pictures on the printer, which wasn't very smart. So your grandfather wrote this fake letter that made it look like it came from a federal judge. And it's Dear B. Bush, it has come to our attention that you have broken federal code number 4212A, and you have been visiting pornography sites. You're going to have to appear in federal court on this date, and your poor Ganny fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. And of course, your grandfather did you get in trouble for?
Maybe mom can speak on that probably, but yes, I'm sure we did. And
Yes, you
I'm sure
did.
Jeb Senior had a few words for Jeb Junior as well. But that's just one of the many, unfortunately, and Gene. And I don't think you want him to get too deep. I've already.
I'm sorry I brought up the P word. Well, we'll let your little brother rescue you, Robert. Robert actually has an infamous incident that even when he isn't, I've done a series of these Prose of Wisdom webinars, and Robert, your mom has told this story. Your cousin Jebby actually told this story. Pierce, I think it was Pierce told this story. You got to tell the story about the Klondike bars.
Yeah, so that's a classic. We when I was a young guy, Gene, I was, I've always been a big guy. I've always been fond of Klondike bars as my dessert of choice. And Ganny and Gampy kept them stocked up in Maine, every type of Klondike bar a young boy could ever want. And I would always, after lunch, after dinner, whatever it was, I would go and help myself to a Klondike bar, to the point where, it'd be all over my face, and to the point where Ganny had to tell me to tone it down. I guess I was starting to pack on some pounds, and so Ganny told me to ease up on the Klondike bars. I told her I would. I did not. I kept going back to the freezer until one day, I guess Ganny had noticed that the Klondikes were being taken. I went to the freezer, and to my surprise, there was a padlock on the freezer that required key to enter. So you had to open it with the key now if you were going to try to get in there for a Klondike bar. And, that was her, I guess, subtle way of telling me to stop, kind of tone it down a little bit. And that's one of my favorite Ganny stories of all time. That's my go-to story, and she really had a special way of letting us know how she felt, and she was the best.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, Robert. Your Ganny really did. The whole time I worked for them, your Ganny was always very interested, in a loving way, of course, of encouraging me to lose weight, and she would say things lovingly like, Jean, for God's sakes, lose weight. and it was, and I some of you have heard me tell this story before, but it's absolutely true. In honor of her, I was going to lose all this weight before I did this book tour. And I'm a big fan of the TV show, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And I was determined to do this book tour. Robert and Sam probably don't watch it, but I bet Doro and Stephanie do. Mm-hmm. I was determined to do this book tour as the cute, adorable, little, marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and it was going to be in honor of Mrs. Bush. Well, yeah, that didn't happen. As it turns out, when I write, I eat. I eat when I write, either way. And I was all depressed about it one day. And then I remembered something that Doro already talked about something important that all of us who knew your Ganny and knew your mom, Doro, learned from her, is she always told all of us to own who you are, be who you are, be your own person. Don't let others define you. And that's when I realized that I did not want to do the book tour as the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I was going to do it as the literary Lizzo. I am the literary Lizzo. Lizzo is my role model, and I felt liberated ever since then. Okay, on that note, the Clinton Library folks solicited some RSVP. There are a couple of really suspicious questions in here that I'm just going to mention. One would be from an Ellie Sosa. I believe that would be, oh yeah, your sister and Doro's daughter, wanting to know who my favorite grandchild is.
That's
so
a good question,
that
Jean.
Question is, Ellie, I'll call you later with the answer. Don't look at me like that, Sam. There's also a very suspicious question from one Tom Frechette, who President Clinton knows well. Tommy traveled all over the world with President Clinton and President Bush, and President Clinton taught Tommy and I how to play Oh Hell. Tommy, who's from Maine, wants me to talk about my favorite memories concerning the Red Sox and the New England Patriots. Yeah, we're not going to do that either, Tom, but thank you for that excellent question. One of the things that a lot of people asked sort of had the same theme to it, and I've really been thinking about it a lot today. If Mrs. Bush were here today, what would you ask her? What advice would you ask her? And Doro, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but I just have to tell you, seeing you there in Maine, I have so many great memories of sitting in your grandparents' bedroom with you and other members of the family, but especially you. You know what I miss most about your mom?
What?
Gossiping with her. How much fun did we have gossiping with her? And as President Clinton, as you mentioned, Doro, it's one of the reasons why she loved President Clinton so much, because President Clinton always brought us great gossip. But we're not going to tell any of it. Anyway, if your mom was here, Doro, what would you like to talk to her about?
I think, she was very vocal about the news of the day. So I wouldn't ask her about what's going on because I'd already know how she felt about all that. I might ask her how to thin the poppies in the garden, or she was a great gardener. And she loved, one of the things, her missions were to leave a place more beautiful than she found it. And that's certainly what she's done up here in Maine. And so I might ask her about gardening and what should I do? When should I prune the hydrangea and things like that. And I miss talking to her about just simple things.
She would love your new dog. Doro just rescued a dog. And I was thinking about how excited she would be about your new dog, Hugh.
Yeah, she loved dogs.
She did. Okay, Sam, you're up next.
Okay, well,
if you were going to see your Ganny this weekend when you came up, what would you talk to her about?
Well, I'm a little different than my mother. I'm kind of a pot stirrer. So I would probably ask her about the news of the day. I'd want to hear what she thinks about, President Trump dealing with COVID-19. I probably wouldn't have to ask her. Just like a lot of things, she would probably offer that up to us anyway. But on a more serious note, I was thinking about this question, Gina, as you were asking it, and I was thinking, what haven't I talked to my grandmother about, or what did I not talk to her about that I wish I had? And I was looking at the panel. I looked at my mom and I thought, I wish I could hear more about the day my mom was born and what they were feeling about. And obviously everyone knows that they had a daughter before and lost her to leukemia, Robin. And I know it was such a blessing for my mom to be born as the fifth child, and they were wishing, I know deep down inside, for a girl. And so I wanted to maybe dig down deeper into what they were feeling that day and the day my mom was born, and more about that. So that's one thing that I kind of maybe regret not asking her about before she passed away. But the news of the day is pretty, as you guys know, it's pretty entertaining to hear Ganny go talk about that as well.
Yes, it would be. Yeah. You are a pot stirrer. I love that. I love that you want to ask about the day that your mom was born. That's really sweet and special, and I love that. I was going to say, when you were showing the letter she wrote you, the Bush kids and family, y'all are so lucky that your parents wrote you so many notes. Both of my parents are gone, and one of my most treasured possessions is anything in their handwriting. I have my mom's recipe box, and I don't ever make any of her recipes because I don't cook that much, but all her recipes are handwritten, and I love that. And just seeing their handwriting, I'm sure it just touches your heart. Okay, Robert, what would you talk to your Ganny about?
Well, I'm gonna agree with you guys and Sam here that it would be a pretty fun conversation to hear Ganny's thoughts on all the latest news. That's something I do miss a lot. And but I think that I would like to ask her, and we are so lucky that we have, your book as a resource, and Sam's letter he just read as a resource. And I would ask her about what it was like to be in a relationship for over 75 years. That's a really special thing. And I was always kind of younger, so that really didn't pertain to my life. But as I am kind of looking to take, moving forward in my life, that's something that's become, more relevant to me. And having a relationship for 75 years with one person is a really special thing. How do you make that work? And the going 75%, as Sam just said, but I would like to hear more about that. And that I think that's what I would ask about.
This story, I'm writing a book about your grandfather, and your mom knows I'm writing this book. I'm writing a book about President Bush's post-presidency, and I'm going to send it to Dora one of these days for her to read so she can tell me if I'm crazy. There's a whole chapter, by the way, about the odd couple. President Clinton and President Bush's friendship get one whole chapter. And yes, the title chapter is The Odd Couple. But listening to you all talk about your Ganny and Gampy and their marriage, this story is sort of well known because your Uncle Jeb put it in his eulogy at your grandmother's funeral. But one of my favorite stories about President and Mrs. Bush, it was about a week before Mrs. Bush died, maybe 2 weeks, and they were both in Methodist Hospital. President Bush was already there. Mrs. Bush had been there, but then went home, but then she came back by ambulance. Anyway, it was Good Friday, 2018, and I went to the hospital just to try to help and be there. And your grandmother wasn't doing very well. She was pretty out of it, and President Bush wanted to go see her. And so they got him in his wheelchair, and quite frankly, he looked awful. He was in a hospital gown. His hair was literally standing straight up. He looked, and he was on oxygen. He looked pretty rough, but they wheeled him in, and he's just sitting next to her bed, holding her hand, and her eyes are closed. And suddenly she opens her eyes and looks at her husband of 73 years. And she said, "My God, George, you are devastatingly handsome." and it was just such a sweet moment. And I was thinking, yeah, he really doesn't look all that good, but she thought he just looked like George Clooney. And then she closed her eyes again, and President Bush looked at me, and he sort of shrugged his shoulders as if to say, well, what can I say? Yeah, I'm just devastatingly, he was pretty cute about it. But I love that story about they were in love until the day she died. And now they're back together again. So it's pretty exciting. I think pretty soon we're going to turn it back over to Stephanie. She's nodding her head because I know she has a couple questions she wants to ask. So Stephanie, do you want to tune back in now?
Thank you, Jean. And I would like to give a little special shout out to our Presidential Leadership Scholars. I know many of them have tuned in this evening because they are also big fans of yours. For those of you who are not familiar, the Presidential Leadership Scholars program is a partnership between the Clinton Presidential Center, the Bush Center in Dallas, the Bush Library and Foundation in College Station, and the LBJ Foundation and Presidential Center in Austin. And this is a tremendous program where young change makers from all over the country come together, put partisanship aside, and really dig deep and try to figure out how to solve some of our world's most pressing challenges. And so Jean has had the opportunity to speak to them many times when they gathered at the Bush Library. And I'd like to tell a quick little poignant story as well. It was actually the very last time that I had the opportunity to be with President Bush and Mrs. Barbara Bush. We were there for the Presidential Leadership Scholars for their module at the Bush Library. And neither President Bush or Mrs. Bush were in very good health at that point. So there was no expectation that the scholars would get to meet them or to see them or to hear from them. But of course, being the gracious, wonderful people that they are, they insisted one day when the scholars were there that we bring them all back, and both of them came in their wheelchairs and spent about 2 hours. They wanted to have a personal conversation with every scholar. There's 60 scholars. Every scholar got to go through the line, shake their hands, have a personal conversation. And if that weren't enough, they also wanted to do that with every single staff person from all 4 of the presidential centers. So I can't tell you what a huge impact that made on me personally, but also I know it had a huge impact on the scholars, and it's one of the stories that I hear most from that class from that year. And then, as you know, Mrs. Bush ended up passing away just about 3 months after that. So again, just they just had such a powerful impact, and so pleased that our scholars had that tremendous opportunity to be with them. I would love to hear maybe, Jean, a few more, if you have any other fun. I know you have so many stories of all the trips with President Bush and President Clinton together. Any other odd couple stories that you want to share with the audience before we go to our final question?
Well, I'm going to steal the story, the Pope's funeral story. I do love this story. First of all, I love when President Clinton came to Walker's Point and we would stay up all night and play Oh Hell when he spent the night, which was so much fun. And now my family's totally addicted to the card game Oh Hell. But the presidents go off on Air Force One. It's just the current president, George W. Bush, President Clinton, neither President Ford nor President Carter could go. They get to Rome about midnight, and they decide to go straight to St. Peter's to pay their respect. The Pope is lying in state at St. Peter's. And from the airport to the Vatican, they, of course, they all rode together in the president's limo. They come out of St. Peter's. It's midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. It's in the middle of the night. And the president and Laura Bush are going to stay at the ambassador's residence. President Bush 41 and President Clinton are staying at a hotel. And the President of the United States says, "Dad, can I give you and Bill a ride?" And the 2 former presidents are like, no. We have our own cars. You go on. And Tom Frechette said you could tell that the president is not thrilled with the idea of leaving his father and President Clinton in the middle of the night in St. Peter's Square. And he's like, "Let me give you a ride." And they're like, "No, go." So the whole White House entourage gets in the motorcade. And when the White House motorcade is gone from St. Peter's Square, there is not one car in sight, not one car. There's nothing. There's no motorcade, no nothing. So while the Secret Service are going crazy, and Tom Frechette's going crazy, the Clinton aides going crazy, trying to find where the heck is their motorcade, Tommy says the 2 presidents are just casually talking. Well, another group pulls up to make their respects to the Pope. And of course, it can't be just any nationality. It's the Syrians. And the Syrians pour out of their car. They're a little surprised to see 2 former presidents, and President Bush and President Clinton do a photo op with the delegation from Syria. I love that story. It is so typical them. At about that time, they did find their cars, thank heavens, and off they went to their hotel. And President Bush came home from that funeral and said that he had just had a wonderful time. And he told me that I was completely wrong, that President Clinton did fine. And I'm pretty sure they also went to Yeltsin's funeral together. They did several funerals together, and you know, it was sort of a good time for them. What can I say?
Yes. Well, go ahead.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead, Sam.
Well, I was going to offer up a story. I just recently had a conversation on our podcast with Jim Nance, the sportscaster Jim Nance, and he recounted a story about one of their first meetings post-presidency. My grandfather went to pick up President Clinton in a boat, and when he got to the dock, President Clinton was standing there at the edge of the dock, and I guess he was told that he had a sort of a back issue. So they decided, instead of riding the boat back, they would drive together. They had a very small motorcade, 2 cars, which is very small for 2 ex-presidents. And Jim Nance was sitting in the car with them and talked about how amazing it was. They were just going down 95 in regular traffic, and who would have known 2 former presidents were in the cars next to them together. And later that evening, they decided to go to dinner at a popular place in Kennebunkport called Stripers. And as they walked into Stripers, Jim Nance couldn't help but be amazed at the faces of all the people in the restaurant as they saw the as you said, Gene, the odd couple together. And it was just an amazing kind of relationship that blossomed from just kind of on a whim to help other people, and you know, as Uncle George said in the eulogy, to a brother from another mother. So it's amazing to see the friendship just blossom, and you know, President Clinton was so kind to our grandfather, my mom's father, and he was so, all the way to the end of his life, was a confidant and a friend, and it was really an amazing relationship.
And you know what? It's such a great example. Stephanie and Doro and Robert and Sam, we're talking about, there were a lot of questions that were sent in about civility, how we've lost our sense of civility today. And what we think Mrs. Bush would say about that? I was afraid to bring up that question because we all know what she would say. But what a great example President Bush and President Clinton were to become best friends after the ugliness of the 1992 campaign. And, they put all that behind them, and they sought out the things that they had in common, which turns out to be a lot. And they genuinely liked each other. And I love talking about their friendship. It's something that we should all learn from. It's a really important lesson. And that's why after everybody buys and reads Pearls of Wisdom, a year from now, you can buy the next book, in which there's a whole chapter about the odd couple. I don't have a name for that book yet. I can't think of a good name. So if you can think of a good name, let me know. Email me. I would love to hear it.
Well, thank you. Jean, before I ask our final question, I wanted to turn back to Mrs. Bush. You had the opportunity to work in the White House and serve as Mrs. Bush's press secretary, and those of us who worked in the White House know what a special relationship the White House staff has with the First Family. And I know from my time in the White House how beloved Mrs. Bush was by the White House staff. Could you share any sort of insight or stories about your time in the White House with Mrs. Bush? Anything about how she liked to spend her time in the White House with the White House resident staff? Anything along those lines?
I'm going to turn that over to Doro. Doro would know to answer that much better than I would. I wasn't upstairs that much. So Doro, talk about your mom's relationship with the White House staff.
Well, she loved the White House staff, and they loved her. She was funny and frank and down to earth. And I think, Dad had brought the culture of the White House together by doing fun things, and Mom was involved in things like the horseshoe tournaments and things that brought everyone closer together. I think, I can't think of a specific story, but I know that they loved her, and she really loved them.
She did. They talked about it a lot when we first came to the White House and how much they loved her. So I'd like to start to conclude our program. And as those of you who have tuned in before know, one of the hallmarks of this Bridge Builders lecture series is we like to ask our speaker to offer really a call to action or a charge to everyone that's tuned in to learn something that really adds to the bridge that together we are building for our future. And while this pandemic has clearly changed about almost everything about our daily lives, there are obviously still moments to be cherished, and we talked about some of those this evening. There are moments that you all have cherished with your grandparents and with your mother and with your former boss, Jean. So I guess, Jean, I'd like to ask you if you could if Mrs. Bush were here today and she were, I'm sure she would have the perfect pearl of wisdom for this current situation that we're currently struggling in. What do you think her call to action would be right now?
You know, I know exactly what it would be, just because I've gotten this question before, and I went back and looked at her speeches after 9/11, and there are a lot of similarities, to completely different situations, but you know, a period of unrest and fear and what does the future hold. And I'm just going to read a couple things she said to an audience right after 9/11. And this is where I got the title of the book from. She says, what I'd really like to do today is to share some of the things I think I've learned in life. You could call them pearls of wisdom. Number one, there is always something to be thankful for if you take the time to look for it. Unfortunately, it seems to me that especially in these uncertain times, people are always looking for the bad and never the good. There are very few situations, no matter how sad or tragic, where most of us can't find something to be grateful for friends and family, for our country, and for our faith. It's such a waste of energy to dwell on the bad and not rejoice in the good. I think that would be her call to action, Stephanie. She didn't like people who whine. She didn't like pity parties. And I think she would just say, buck up, get over it, and you know, look for those silver linings in life. And when I found this in the book, it really made me miss her. I thought, oh my God, we still need her voice in our life. It's just the best advice, to look for the good and get over the bad. It's a waste of time.
Well, thank you. Again, the book is Pearls of Wisdom, Little Pieces of Advice That Go a Long Way. I'm going to again show it up here on my screen. And I know that you all will want to rush to buy this, and you can actually order this from the Clinton Museum Store, which is clintonmuseumstore.org. So I would encourage you to log on and to purchase this book. And just really want to thank you, Jean, for your friendship and for sharing your time with us this evening. For me, one of the silver linings, the Clinton Presidential Center, and I know the Bush Center and our other colleagues at presidential centers are learning how to deliver experiences to our visitors virtually. And so appreciate you participating in our second virtual Bridge Builder conversation tonight. We plan to have many of these over the months ahead. And again, just a special thanks to you, Doro, and to Sam and Robert for joining us. Your participation made this so personal and so special, and really loved hearing the warm and wonderful stories about two of America's treasures, President George H.W. Bush and Mrs. Barbara Bush. What an amazing example, their life, their marriage, everything that they have set for all of us and for all of our viewers watching tonight. So on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Clinton Foundation, I want to thank our audience, everyone, for tuning in tonight, and I hope you stay safe and healthy, and good night. And bye.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephanie.
Thanks to President Clinton too. Bye.
Thank you, President Clinton. Bye-bye.